Move it, old man, this isn't a social club. The words hit like a steel door slamming in the middle of a quiet morning. Harold Thompson, 72, shuffled his cane on the polished linoleum of the precinct's lobby, eyes fixed on the counter, heart racing. He wasn't loud, he wasn't confrontational, but the officer behind the desk, young, sharp, and impatient, didn't seem to notice the weight of his age or the weight of his experience. "Sir, I said move it along," the cop repeated, voice clipped, sharp enough to cut through the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. "We don't have time for you to lollygag here." Harold's hands trembled, not with fear, but with the indignation of being treated like a child, like he was invisible. He straightened his back, letting the cane click against the floor. "I'm here to report something serious," he said, steady despite the sting of humiliation. The officer glanced at the clock behind him, then back at Harold. His eyes narrowed, not with concern but with irritation. "Serious? You don't look like you've got anything serious to report. I've seen plenty of folks wasting our time today. You can sit down over there and wait your turn." Harold swallowed. He wanted to explain, to make them see, but words stumbled against the sneer of youth. "I've got a file. Old. Could be important. Could—" The officer cut him off, waving a dismissive hand. "Old? Nobody cares about old stuff. This is the now. You've got to deal with the present, old-timer. Sit, wait. Maybe by the time you figure it out, we'll have forgotten why you're even here." Harold felt his jaw tighten. He had walked through this door with purpose, with urgency. The file in his bag was worn, edges frayed, corners dog-eared. It held a truth buried for decades, a truth that someone powerful had tried to erase, and yet here he was, treated as if the weight of history, the lives lost, and the lessons learned were nothing more than the ramblings of a frail man. He shifted his weight, leaning heavily on the cane, and tried again. "I'm not wasting time. This could help. It's connected to a case you need to see." The officer snorted. "Case? Yeah, right. You're telling me a 72-year-old man with a black briefcase has a case we need to care about?" He laughed, sharp and condescending, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. The laughter cut into Harold like a knife. Humiliation was one thing, but dismissal when lives were potentially at stake? That was something else entirely. Harold's chest tightened. He had seen this before. Not here maybe, but in every courtroom, in every meeting, in every encounter where his voice was expected to be small. "I don't have time for jokes," he said, voice low but firm. "I need to speak with someone who can—" "Look, old man," the officer said, leaning over the counter, smirk firmly in place. "I don't care what you think is important. If you're not on a waiting list, if you don't have an appointment, and if it isn't fresh news, you can take your old files and go. Understood?" Harold's urgency mind surged. He could feel it in every nerve. Something was about to happen, something that might bring the truth out into the light. He couldn't let this moment slip through bureaucracy, through impatience, through willful ignorance. This file wasn't just old, it was the key to an injustice someone had hoped would be forgotten. A clerk in the corner raised an eyebrow at the exchange. A few citizens waiting on benches looked on with varying expressions, discomfort, curiosity, some even irritation at the disruption. But Harold didn't notice any of it. He was focused entirely on getting someone, anyone, to hear him. "I've brought this file for a reason," he said more firmly this time, his voice carrying authority that the young cop clearly didn't expect. "There are people in danger, consequences you might not even imagine if you ignore it. You need to look at it now." The officer leaned back, smirking as if waiting for a punchline. "Oh, I get it. You're some kind of prophet now, the old sage warning us about some danger we can't see. Sorry, pal, I'm a cop, not a psychic. We deal with facts, reports, and cases filed properly, not the ghost of old grudges." Harold's hands tightened around the handle of his cane. "It's not a grudge. It's not a ghost. It's real. People's lives are—" Another officer walked past, overhearing the argument. "What's going on here?" she asked, tone neutral but alert. "This guy thinks he's bringing us something important," the officer said, waving Harold off.
but I don't have time for his old stories." The second officer glanced at Harold, noticing his age, the dignity in his posture, the urgency radiating from him. Something in her paused. She wasn't the first to dismiss him, but she felt a flicker of awareness. Maybe this man's presence wasn't trivial. Maybe he carried something beyond what anyone else could understand. Harold's voice dropped to a whisper, so quiet it barely reached the first officer. "Open it. Look inside. You'll see." But the officer ignored him, shoving his paperwork aside. "You're wasting your breath. Now leave." A surge of frustration and fear gripped Harold. He couldn't leave. He had walked miles this morning, carried that file with trembling hands, and gathered every scrap of courage to stand here and be dismissed like he was nothing. Lives depended on it. Justice depended on it. Truth depended on it. And then, through the hum of the fluorescent lights and the quiet murmurs of the waiting room, he heard a name that made his heart leap. "Detective Lewis, can you come here?" The second officer had radioed someone, a senior detective, apparently intrigued herself. She approached cautiously, opening the door for a man in his mid-50s, graying at the temples, eye sharp beneath the brim of a fedora. Harold's hands shook as he extended the black file toward him. "Detective Lewis, this has to be seen. It's about the case from '79, the Carter investigation." Lewis's brow furrowed. "Carter? That case was cold decades ago. Nothing left to pursue." "It's not cold," Harold insisted. "Someone covered up what really happened. People paid to erase it, and now it's resurfacing. This file has the evidence." The detective took the file slowly, as if afraid to open it, afraid that what lay inside could change everything. Around them, the room fell into tense quiet. The young officer, who had been dismissive seconds ago, now watched, uncertain. Harold straightened, cane tapping softly on the floor. His chest heaved, not from exertion, but from the weight of decades pressing down on him. The years of being unheard, unseen, ignored simply because of his age, his race, his quiet demeanor. And then, as Lewis carefully flipped through the pages, photographs, handwritten notes, and faded newspaper clippings began to reveal the truth. The officer behind the desk stiffened. The other civilians leaned forward, curiosity replacing boredom. Even the clerk in the corner straightened. For the first time in the room, Harold felt the power of being heard. This changes everything," Lewis murmured, eyes widening. Harold's lips quivered. He had done it. He had finally forced the world to stop and pay attention, if only for a moment. But he knew this was only the beginning, because uncovering the truth was just the first step. The fight to make the world see it would be far from over. And in that moment, as the station fell silent around him, Harold Thompson realized something profound. You don't need to be loud to be heard. You just need to carry the truth and refuse to let anyone ignore it.
Detective Lewis held the file like it might combust under the weight of its own secrets. Pages whispered against one another as he flipped through them carefully, his eyes scanning faded ink, yellowed photographs, and typed reports from a time when justice was selective, when corners were cut for convenience, and when Harold Thompson's voice would have made no difference. You have all of this?" Lewis muttered, disbelief coloring his tone. Harold's hands tightened on his cane. Every page, every note, every witness statement they thought they'd buried. The young officer from the front desk, who had barely concealed his annoyance moments ago, leaned forward. "Wait, you mean this old man found?" "Yes," Harold said sharply, though his voice carried a calm authority that silenced the interruption. "I didn't find it. I've been keeping it, making sure it survived, because someone in '79 wanted to cover it up. Someone who had power, money, and no conscience." A low hum of murmurs spread across the station. Civilians stopped scrolling through their phones. Officers abandoned their paperwork. Even the clerk who had been typing quietly paused, fingers hovering above the keys. There was a magnetic pull around Harold, the kind of quiet that demanded attention. Lewis glanced at him, skeptical but intrigued. "And why now?"
After all this time? Harold inhaled, the weight of years pressing down on his chest. Because the truth doesn't have an expiration date, and because people are still suffering from what happened, it's time they knew. Detective Lewis leaned back, eyes narrowing as he studied Harold. "All right, walk me through it. Start at the beginning." Harold nodded, slowly, methodically. "It was 1979. I was 29, a young man with my whole life ahead of me. I worked as a janitor at the old precinct downtown. It was a different city then, different rules. And one day, a case came in." He paused, the memories flickering behind his tired eyes. A missing girl, 9 years old. Her name was Lisa Carter, the kind of case that should have made headlines. But it didn't, because the man responsible was someone important, someone untouchable. Lewis's pen hovered over a notepad. Untouchable? Harold's jaw tightened. Politicians, business tycoons, law enforcement insiders, people who knew how to hide things, manipulate evidence, and make problems disappear. Lisa's disappearance was convenient for them, and because I was young, black, and quiet, no one took my observations seriously, no one asked questions. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade away. "What did you see?" Lewis asked cautiously. Harold exhaled slowly, the weight of decades spilling into the moment. "I saw how evidence was moved. I saw how interviews altered. I saw people threatened into silence. And I saw the man who did it walk free, smiling, shaking hands at some charity event, while the girl's family cried at home, powerless." A young officer whispered, almost to himself, "I can't believe this." Believe it or don't, but it's here in this file. Witness statements, letters, even photographs taken surreptitiously by a friend of mine who knew the right people to avoid suspicion. It's all here, and it all proves what really happened. Detective Lewis leaned forward, flipping through a stack of photographs. Each one told a story: a blurred figure in a parking lot, a letter threatening a potential whistleblower, a handwritten note detailing who had been bribed and when. The details were meticulous, painstakingly organized. "How did you even keep this safe all these years?" he asked, astonished. "I had to," Harold said quietly. "If it had fallen into the wrong hands, well, I don't even want to imagine." The young officer, still looking incredulous, muttered, "So all this time we ignored the truth because he didn't look like someone we'd listen to?" Harold's lips tightened. "Exactly. Because I was quiet, because I was black, because I didn't fit the narrative that people wanted to see. But the truth doesn't care who you are, it only cares if you have the courage to show it." Lewis nodded slowly. This could reopen the entire investigation. It could bring down people who are still in power. Some of them are probably very well connected. Harold's gaze didn't waver. "Then they need to be exposed. They need to be held accountable. Lisa's family deserves closure, and anyone else who was silenced deserves justice." The clerk at the corner, who had been silent until now, leaned forward, eyes wide. "I can't believe this is real. This is incredible." "Real enough, and dangerous enough. That's why I brought it here. That's why I insisted on someone listening." Lewis flipped through a few more pages. "There's names here, dates, locations. If we pursue this, we could finally close a wound that never healed." Harold nodded, exhaustion and determination mingling in his expression. "And if we do nothing, people will continue to suffer. That's why you have to act. Not tomorrow, not next week, now." A tense silence fell over the station. Even the dismissive young officer seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. His earlier bravado had vanished. He shuffled his feet, avoiding Harold's eyes. "You know," Lewis said finally, looking around at the gathered staff, "I've been on the force for 32 years. I've never seen anyone stand up the way this man has. Quiet, steady, unrelenting, and yet somehow we almost ignored him." Harold's eyes softened slightly. "You don't have to be loud to be heard. You just have to refuse to leave until someone listens." Lewis flipped the last page and looked at Harold with a mix of awe and apprehension. This changes everything. I think we need to pull the original case files, re-interview anyone still alive, and start connecting the dots. Harold exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of years beginning to lift. But he also knew the real challenge was just beginning. Exposing corruption, especially when it involved powerful people, was dangerous. It could turn allies into enemies, colleagues into threats. And yet, there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing Detective Lewis nod with conviction, ready to take action. "You did the right thing," Lewis said softly. "You've given this case a voice, a real voice." Harold's fingers tightened on the cane. "I didn't do it for me. I did it for the girl, for the families silenced, for the truth itself." The young officer, still hesitant, finally spoke. "I think we should listen, really listen. Maybe it's time we started paying attention to people who have been ignored for too long." Harold gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Then we start now. No delays, no excuses." Outside the station, the city hummed with life, oblivious to the storm brewing inside. But within these walls, decades of silence were about to be shattered. Names, dates, and crimes that had long been forgotten were now alive again, demanding acknowledgement, demanding justice. And Harold Thompson, the quiet black grandfather who had once been overlooked, was at the center of it all. The one who had refused to be invisible, who had refused to accept dismissal as an answer. The one who, finally, had made them listen. Because sometimes the most overlooked voices carry the heaviest truths. And in this station, in that moment, everyone was about to understand just how heavy those truths could be. Detective Lewis called a private meeting in the back conference room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the table where the evidence had been spread out. Copies of Harold Thompson's meticulously preserved files lay in neat stacks, faded photographs, handwritten notes, typewritten reports and witness statements, some signed, some anonymous. Each piece told a fragment of the same haunting story, a story that had been suppressed for over 40 years. Harold sat at the head of the table, cane resting against the leg of his chair, his eyes calm but resolute. Around him, the room was filled with younger officers who had spent their entire careers trusting paperwork, cameras, and digital surveillance, yet now found themselves confronted with raw, tangible history that demanded careful attention. "You all need to look at this and understand something," Harold began, his voice steady but carrying decades of unspoken frustration. "This isn't just old news. This isn't a case someone botched and walked away from. This is a web of intentional deceit, powerful people protecting themselves, and anyone who spoke out was silenced." Lewis nodded, flipping open a folder to a photograph of a young girl, her eyes wide and frightened, yet holding a quiet defiance. Lisa Carter, 9 years old, missing, and it looks like the investigation went cold because of someone's influence. Harold's gaze didn't waver. Correct, and the people who should have protected her, who were sworn to uphold the law, instead helped bury her case. They erased witnesses, destroyed evidence, and even falsified reports. And because I was quiet, because I didn't have a loud voice or the right connections, no one took me seriously when I tried to speak. A junior officer cleared her throat nervously. "Sir, if what you're saying is true, these people are still alive. Some of them might even be in positions of power right now." Harold's eyes sharpened. "Exactly, which is why this isn't just a cold case. This is a ticking time bomb. If we fail to confront it, the lies will continue. Families will continue to be silenced. The only way forward is transparency, full accountability." Lewis leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "All right, we're listening. Let's start with the witnesses. Who's still alive?" Harold flipped through the notes in his folder. 2. Both were intimidated, but they gave me statements at the time that survived only because I kept copies. One worked at the precinct as a typist. She saw files disappear. The other, a neighbor who took notes of what she overheard. Both were afraid, but willing to talk if someone would protect them. The room seemed to shrink with the weight of the revelation. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. Even the senior detective, known for his stoicism, leaned forward, frowning. "And these files, you're saying everything in here can be corroborated?" Harold tapped the stack. "Yes. Photographs, letters, handwritten notes, and a timeline that I reconstructed. Every detail aligns. You can't ignore it. You cannot sweep it under the rug." Lewis exhaled slowly. "This is explosive and dangerous. If we pursue this, some people won't just resist, they'll try to shut us down, maybe even threaten our careers, our safety. Are you prepared for that?" Harold didn't flinch. "I've lived with that fear my whole life. I survived it then. I'll survive it now. The difference is, I have a chance to finally make people listen." A junior officer raised her hand, hesitation clear in her voice. "But sir, if what you're saying is true, these people are still alive. Some of them might even be in positions of power right now." Harold's eyes sharpened. "Exactly, which is why this isn't just a cold case. This is a ticking time bomb. If we fail to confront it, the lies will continue. Families will continue to be silenced. The only way forward is transparency, full accountability." Lewis leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "All right, we're listening. Let's start with the witnesses. Who's still alive?" Harold flipped through the notes in his folder. "Two. Both were intimidated, but they gave me statements at the time that survived only because I kept copies. One worked at the precinct as a typist. She saw files disappear. The other, a neighbor who took notes of what she overheard. Both were afraid, but willing to talk if someone would protect them." The room seemed to shrink with the weight of the revelation. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. Even the senior detective, known for his stoicism, leaned forward, frowning. "And these files, you're saying everything in here can be corroborated?" Harold tapped the stack. "Yes. Photographs, letters, handwritten notes, and a timeline that I reconstructed. Every detail aligns. You can't ignore it. You cannot sweep it under the rug." Lewis exhaled slowly. "This is explosive and dangerous. If we pursue this, some people won't just resist, they'll try to shut us down, maybe even threaten our careers, our safety. Are you prepared for that?" Harold didn't flinch. "I've lived with that fear my whole life. I survived it then. I'll survive it now. The difference is, I have a chance to finally make people listen." A junior officer raised her hand, hesitation clear in her voice. "But sir, if what you're saying is true, these people are still alive. Some of them might even be in positions of power right now." Harold's eyes sharpened. "Exactly, which is why this isn't just a cold case. This is a ticking time bomb. If we fail to confront it, the lies will continue. Families will continue to be silenced. The only way forward is transparency, full accountability." Lewis leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "All right, we're listening. Let's start with the witnesses. Who's still alive?" Harold flipped through the notes in his folder. "Two. Both were intimidated, but they gave me statements at the time that survived only because I kept copies. One worked at the precinct as a typist. She saw files disappear. The other, a neighbor who took notes of what she overheard. Both were afraid, but willing to talk if someone would protect them." The room seemed to shrink with the weight of the revelation. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. Even the senior detective, known for his stoicism, leaned forward, frowning. "And these files, you're saying everything in here can be corroborated?" Harold tapped the stack. "Yes. Photographs, letters, handwritten notes, and a timeline that I reconstructed. Every detail aligns. You can't ignore it. You cannot sweep it under the rug." Lewis exhaled slowly. "This is explosive and dangerous. If we pursue this, some people won't just resist, they'll try to shut us down, maybe even threaten our careers, our safety. Are you prepared for that?" Harold didn't flinch. I've lived with that fear my whole life. I survived it then. I'll survive it now.
The difference is, I have a chance to finally make people listen. A young officer raised her hand, hesitation clear in her voice. But, sir, how do we even begin? These aren't ordinary witnesses. They're scared. Some could be compromised. Some may be too old to remember exact details. Harold's expression softened slightly. Memory isn't everything. Corroboration is key. Look at patterns, documents, names, dates. Small inconsistencies in official reports can reveal the truth. And if we start with the right witnesses, the ones who still have courage, the rest will follow. Lewis nodded, scanning the files again. We'll need to be careful. We can't just broadcast this internally or outside the department. If any of these people get wind, they might destroy evidence, or worse, intimidate the witnesses. Harold's gaze was steady, unyielding. Then we make a plan, quiet, precise, and most importantly, we move before anyone realizes what's happening. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The air grew heavier, as though the files themselves carried a weight that pressed down on everyone present. Officers leaned forward, eyes wide, hands brushing over photographs, letters, and notes. Each item carried a fragment of injustice. Each page demanded acknowledgement. Lewis looked at Harold. All right, let's do this systematically. First, the typist. Her name? Marion Peters, Harold said, flipping through a folder labeled in neat handwriting. She worked at the precinct during the investigation. She witnessed files vanish. She overheard conversations. She wanted to testify back then, but no one listened. Then we get her, Lewis said, discreetly. We need her testimony, corroboration for the timeline and the manipulations. Harold nodded. And after her, we reach the neighbor, Mrs. Franklin. She's elderly now, but she's sharp. She'll remember more than anyone expects, and her notes survived, buried in her attic for decades. She feared retaliation then, but now, decades later, people are more accountable. The senior detective spoke up. We also need to cross-reference these names with anyone who was in positions of authority at the time. Officers, supervisors, politicians, anyone who might have had a hand in suppressing the investigation. Lewis exhaled, shaking his head slightly. This is bigger than I imagined. It's not just a cold case. This is a network of deception hidden in plain sight for decades. Harold's voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of decades of silence. And that's why I stayed quiet, because even when I tried to speak, no one cared. They didn't want to see the truth, and I've learned, if you wait for people to care, decades can pass. But if you insist on speaking, eventually, someone has to listen. The young officer shifted nervously. Sir, you've been quiet for so long, and now suddenly we're supposed to believe every word? Some of this could be mistaken. Memories fade, documents get lost or misinterpreted. Harold's eyes flashed. I've spent years cross-checking. Every statement, every document, every photograph aligns. This isn't about memory alone. It's about patterns, about corruption, about power hiding behind the appearance of propriety. Lewis leaned back, pinching the bridge of his nose. Okay, then we start small. Witnesses, verification, pattern mapping, step by step, quietly, so we don't tip anyone off. If this is as big as it looks, we need precision. Harold's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. Exactly. And once we start, there's no turning back. But that's okay, because justice, it doesn't wait forever, and neither should we. A hush fell over the room. Everyone understood the gravity of the moment. They weren't just handling an old case. They were handling decades of suppressed truth, long ignored, long silenced. And now, thanks to Harold Thompson, the quiet grandfather who had patiently preserved every shred of evidence, the truth was about to emerge. Lewis closed his folder and looked at Harold, his tone resolute. All right, we'll follow your lead. Let's get Marion Peters first, then Mrs. Franklin, and then we start unraveling the rest, one thread at a time, carefully, quietly, but decisively. Harold nodded,
relief and determination mingling in his expression. "Then let's begin, because if we don't act now, we let history repeat itself, and that's a risk I'm not willing to take, not for Lisa, not for anyone who's been silenced." And with that, the room seemed to shift. Officers straightened, determination replacing hesitation. For the first time in decades, the files on the table weren't just paper, they were a call to action, and the man who had been ignored for so long had finally made them understand. Some truths are louder than any voice. Some truths demand to be heard. And Harold Thompson was ready to make sure everyone listened.
The fluorescent lights in the old precinct building buzzed like an impatient metronome as Harold Thompson and Detective Lewis made their way down the narrow corridor toward the records room. Every step echoed, a faint reminder that decades of bureaucracy had once walked these same halls, dismissing voices like Harold's. The air smelled of aged paper, dust, and something faintly metallic, the scent of history waiting to be uncovered. Harold gripped his cane tightly, his knuckles pale, but his gaze was steady. Beside him, Lewis carried a small digital recorder, folders, and a folder of Miriam Peters' statements that had survived in Harold's meticulous care. Today, they were going to meet Marion. Today, they were going to begin the slow, deliberate act of untangling a web of silence that had nearly suffocated justice. The door to the precinct records office creaked as they entered. Marion Peters sat behind a metal desk, her back rigid, hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles shone white. Age had softened her features, but the tension in her shoulders spoke of decades spent carrying secrets she never wanted to confront. "Marion," Harold began gently, "thank you for agreeing to meet. I know it hasn't been easy." Her eyes flicked toward him, guarded yet curious. "I didn't think anyone would ever care," she whispered. "All those years, all those reports, they were erased. Who would listen?" Detective Lewis set the recorder on the desk, clicking it on. The small red light blinked, capturing the room in a faint glow. "We're listening now," he said firmly. "You have every right to tell the truth without fear. That's why we're here." Marion exhaled slowly, the weight of decades pressing down. It's still hard to speak. I watched them take files, one by one. Officers, supervisors, even the captain. They didn't want to see what was real. They wanted the case closed. And when I tried to speak, they threatened me. I thought if I stayed quiet, I'd be safe." Harold's eyes were steady, almost gentle. "You were never silent, Marion. You preserved what mattered, and that's why we can finally act." Her lips trembled as she nodded. "All right, I'll tell you everything I remember, every word, every movement, every file I saw disappear." The room seemed to contract as Marion began recounting events from decades ago, events that felt as immediate as if they had occurred yesterday. She described the young girl, Lisa Carter, and the frantic parents whose pleas were dismissed by officers too willing to believe official convenience over truth. She spoke of reports shredded in secret, of witness statements lost or altered, of nights when the precinct echoed with whispered warnings that anyone asking questions could disappear. Lewis leaned forward, scribbling notes furiously. "And you saw all of this firsthand?" Marion nodded. "I did. I couldn't stop it. I didn't have the power, but I remembered. I remembered every detail. I saved what I could, because someone had to." Harold watched her, his voice soft but firm. "And now, that someone is you again. We're going to make sure the world knows what happened." The tension in the room was nearly suffocating. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder, more urgent, as if the building itself was bracing for the truth to shatter its walls. Lewis spoke next. "Marion, we need names, dates, everything you can recall. Any officers who were involved, supervisors who directed the cover-up, anyone who influenced the reports. We'll protect your identity. We'll make sure nothing happens to you." Marion's eyes darted toward Harold, then back to Lewis. "There was Captain Reynolds. He ordered the files removed. And Lieutenant Harper,
He falsified reports. And then there were other names I can't recall off the top of my head, but they were there. They all knew what they were doing. And the parents, they were powerless. No one listened. Lewis exhaled, running his hair through his head. We need everything you can give us. Documents, notes, even memories. It all counts. Harold added softly, You've already done more than you realize. By speaking now, you're finally giving that child a voice. Marion's shoulders trembled. It's terrifying. If anyone finds out I'm talking. Harold met her gaze with unflinching calm. Then they will see that decades of silence cannot withstand courage. We're here to ensure that truth survives, no matter the cost. She swallowed hard, nodding, and began reading from her notes. She described the day Lisa disappeared, the hurried investigations that were abruptly halted, and the specific officers who had manipulated, erased, or threatened to suppress the case. Each name, each action painted a vivid picture of systemic obstruction that had silenced a family and a community. Lewis occasionally paused to ask clarifying questions, but Harold allowed Marion to speak uninterrupted. There was a rhythm to her recollections, a slow unfolding of the story that had been buried beneath layers of fear. Her words carried the weight of decades of frustration, sorrow, and righteous indignation. Hours passed as the testimony continued. Outside, the precinct hummed with the usual activity, ringing phones, typing, footsteps on polished floors. But inside the small room, time seemed suspended. Each new detail brought another wave of tension. Officers who had prided themselves on understanding procedure now confronted with the chilling reality of how easily procedure could be manipulated to protect the powerful. Finally, Marion paused, her hands shaking slightly. That's everything I remember. I've carried it for decades. I hoped someone would listen before it was too late. Lewis leaned back, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. You've done more than you realize. This testimony, it's a cornerstone. It gives us direction, leverage, and proof. And now, Harold, it's time we reach Mrs. Franklin. Harold nodded, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Yes, she will remember everything too, and together, their words will form a chain that no one can break. Before leaving, Lewis assured Marion, We'll protect you. You're not alone in this. Today, you've taken the first step towards justice, the first real step. Marion exhaled, relief and fear mingling in her gaze. I hope it's enough. Harold placed a reassuring hand on hers. It will be. Courage like yours is the kind that echoes through decades. People might have ignored us then, but no one can ignore the truth forever. As they left the records office, the hallway seemed quieter than usual. The weight of the testimonies hung in the air, palpable, as if the very walls had absorbed decades of fear and secrecy. Outside, the day continued. Phones rang, officers moved, doors opened and closed. Yet Harold and Lewis carried with them a knowledge that the first real confrontation had begun. A confrontation not just with the facts, but with history itself. And in the coming days, that confrontation would force the precinct, the city, and those long protected by silence to finally face the consequences of choices made decades earlier. The quiet grandfather and the young detective were no longer just investigating a case, they were dismantling a carefully constructed facade, piece by piece.
The tension was rising, and nothing would ever be the same again. The precinct felt different after the interview. The fluorescent lights no longer just buzzed, they seemed to hum with tension, vibrating like a warning siren. Word of Marion Peters' testimony spread, quietly but quickly, slipping through cracks in the bureaucracy like a whisper no one could fully ignore. The officers who had once dismissed Harold Thompson as a harmless, quiet presence now looked at him with a mixture of wariness and disbelief. How could one old man, so unassuming, have unearthed evidence that threatened to expose decades of negligence and cover-ups? Harold felt the eyes on him, but did not flinch. He had faced the long silence for years. A few startled glances weren't enough to shake him.
He moved slowly through the precinct, his cane clicking on the linoleum, but each step carried a weight that no uniform could dismiss. Behind him, Detective Lewis kept a protective distance, scanning faces, noting whispers, and observing every twitch of unease in officers who had spent lifetimes believing themselves untouchable. Outside the records room, Sergeant Miller, a man whose tenure stretched back 35 years, muttered under his breath, "Did you hear about Peters? She's telling everything, and Harold's behind it." He glanced nervously at the new recruits, who avoided eye contact, sensing the storm brewing. "We've handled cases like this quietly before. We can't have this blowing up now." Blowing up, that was exactly what was happening. Within hours, confidential notes, archived files, and faded photographs were scrutinized under bright desk lamps by officers who had spent years ignoring them. Names that had once gone unpunished now leapt from yellowed pages like ghosts demanding attention. Witness accounts that had been shelved, dismissed, or altered were suddenly alive, voices echoing across time. And through it all, Harold remained calm, each movement measured, deliberate, his presence a subtle declaration that the truth would not be silenced again. Meanwhile, back in his small East Side apartment, Harold's phone vibrated constantly. Calls from journalists, legal aid workers, and former witnesses flooded in. Some were tentative, polite, others were direct, urgent. They all sought the same thing: confirmation that Harold Thompson had indeed taken the first, bold step against the machinery that had silenced generations. At the precinct, Lewis compiled a detailed report of Marion's testimony and cross-referenced it with the files Harold had uncovered. Each entry highlighted negligence, intentional obstruction, and abuse of authority. The gravity of the evidence was inescapable. They were no longer dealing with a single instance of misconduct. They were staring at a systemic failure that had spanned decades. When the precinct captain, a man named Reynolds, finally learned the extent of the interview and the evidence it had generated, he slammed his fist on his desk. "This can't be happening," he barked. His office, usually pristine and intimidating, now felt claustrophobic under the weight of truth he had long avoided. "We've already closed these cases. They're old. People move on." Harold, standing outside the captain's office, said nothing. He didn't need to. The calm in his expression spoke louder than any words. The unspoken message was clear. Moving on without accountability was no longer an option. Meanwhile, the ripple effect reached the community. Families who had quietly mourned justice, who had never seen their complaints taken seriously, now found renewed hope. A small neighborhood association scheduled meetings, local journalists began combing through past reports, and legal aid offices prepared to assist victims who had once been ignored. Harold's phone rang incessantly, messages arriving by the dozen. People wanted to meet him, to share memories, to see if the quiet man who had dared challenge the precinct was real, and he was. Yet the fallout wasn't entirely supportive. Some officers and staff began whispering about Harold behind his back. Accusations of stirring trouble, of disrespecting the badge, of tarnishing reputations circulated with the speed of wildfire. Rumors suggested that Harold had personal motives, that his involvement was somehow improper. But Lewis noticed something in those whispers, a fear that went beyond gossip. These were people suddenly aware that decades of carefully constructed narratives were crumbling, and Harold Thompson, quiet, observant, and persistent, had become the instrument of their reckoning. The first public acknowledgement of the case came when an internal memo accidentally leaked. It was brief, bureaucratic in tone, but its implications were explosive. An active review of past cases has been initiated based on new testimony and recovered evidence. No further comment at this time. Within minutes, the memo circulated throughout local news channels, triggering a wave of concern and curiosity among citizens. The names, dates, and incidents that had been buried were now being asked about openly, even on morning news segments and community radio stations. At the precinct, officers were forced to reconcile decades of inaction with the evidence now laid bare. Lieutenant Harper, whose actions had once shaped false narratives, avoided Harold's gaze at every turn. Captain Reynolds convened a meeting with top brass, demanding discretion and attempting to contain the brewing storm. But even within those walls, whispers persisted. The public would not tolerate silence any longer. Harold's own reflection in the precinct's polished floors reminded him that this was not about him. It was about the community, the families, and the truth long buried. Each step forward was painful, requiring him to revisit moments that were bitterly familiar, times when he had been ignored, laughed at, or dismissed as just an old man. Yet the knowledge that the truth had allies, that voices like Marion Peters were now speaking openly, gave him strength. By the end of the day, several key witnesses had been interviewed. Each account corroborated parts of Marion's testimony, filling gaps and providing a clearer picture of the long-neglected case. Patterns emerged, patterns of intentional cover-up, selective enforcement, and systematic intimidation. Even officers who had been passive bystanders were implicated by their silence, demonstrating that the failure of justice was not isolated to a few individuals, but was embedded in the precinct's culture. Word reached local media by late afternoon. Headlines began to appear online, in print, and on television. Grandfather sparks review of cold case, decades of silence broken by elderly witness, and community demands accountability after buried files resurfaced. The attention was immediate, unavoidable, and unprecedented. Citizens called the precinct, demanding information and transparency. Harold received a call from a former city council member, someone who had followed the original case closely. "Mr. Thompson," the voice said, "I can't tell you how relieved I am that someone is finally taking this seriously. People need to know the truth. We need to act now." Harold's reply was measured, quiet, yet firm. "Truth waits for no one. If we do our jobs right, it will outlive us all." As night fell over the city, the precinct was a hive of controlled chaos. Officers who had once dismissed Harold now watched him with cautious respect. Witnesses, inspired by Marion's courage, prepared statements. Legal teams organized the documents, and somewhere in the hum of fluorescent lights and distant traffic, Harold allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. He thought of the families who had suffered silently, of the child who never received justice, and of every officer who had turned a blind eye. For a moment, the weight of decades of injustice pressed down, heavy and relentless, but it was no longer unbearable. The fallout was more than procedural, it was cultural. Every conversation in the precinct now carried a subtext. The past could not be ignored. Every officer who had once believed they could bury inconvenient truths now understood that silence was a liability. And for Harold Thompson, the quiet grandfather, the fallout was proof that persistence, memory, and moral courage could dismantle decades of complicity. Yet Harold knew the real challenge was just beginning. The next steps would require strategy, patience, and resilience. Documents had to be cross-checked, witnesses protected, and public statements carefully coordinated. The fallout had begun, but the reckoning, the moment when those responsible would face consequences, was still to come. Walking home that evening, Harold's cane clicked against the cracked sidewalk, echoing faintly in the quiet streets. In his mind, he replayed every interview, every whispered confession, and every hushed warning. The fallout had changed everything, but Harold knew the truth would demand more than exposure. It would demand action, integrity, and the courage to confront the powerful. And Harold Thompson was ready.
By the next morning, Harold Thompson's quiet defiance had become a lightning rod. News of the resurfaced evidence and Marion Peters' testimony spread like wildfire through the precinct, the city, and even social media. The same officers who had once dismissed Harold as a harmless old man now whispered his name with a mixture of disbelief and resentment. Some called him a hero, yes, but many others, those with reputations and decades of comfort built on silence, saw him as a threat. From the moment Harold walked into the precinct, he could feel it. The stares were sharp, like daggers. Hands shifted uneasily over desks. Phones were subtly angled to watch him. His cane tapped rhythmically on the polished floor, each click a heartbeat that reminded everyone he was still standing. He had expected resistance, but nothing prepared him for the orchestrated tension he now faced. "Old man stirring up trouble again," muttered Officer Grant, leaning back in his chair, eyes narrowed. "Think he's going to ruin everyone's careers just to feel relevant?" Detective Lewis, standing nearby, shot Grant a look that silenced him for a moment, but it was fleeting. The precinct was a pressure cooker now, every officer aware that the past could no longer be contained, every file that had been shoved into dark corners now pulling them toward exposure. The backlash came in waves, subtle at first, anonymous notes left on desks, accusing Harold of fabricating claims or twisting Marion's testimony. Emails circulated with questions about Harold's credibility, suggesting that the old man had a personal vendetta. Even within the legal department, murmurs suggested that Harold's actions were reckless, that he could destabilize the precinct and public trust. Yet Harold remained calm. He understood how power reacted when threatened. The silent force of decades-old negligence was now facing the piercing light of truth, and those who had thrived in the shadows were scrambling to protect themselves. At 9:47 a.m., a meeting was called by Captain Reynolds, who tried to maintain an air of authority, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. The room was packed. Officers shifted uncomfortably as Reynolds spoke. "Let's be clear," he began, clearing his throat. "We have a situation regarding past cases. New evidence has surfaced. Some of it is serious. But I want to remind everyone, procedures must be followed. No one should take unilateral action." Harold's presence was palpable at the back of the room, cane in hand, eye steady. He had not spoken, but every officer knew he had started the chain reaction. "Procedures," muttered Officer Grant under his breath. "Procedures didn't work before, did they?" Reynolds' gaze snapped toward him, sharp as a whip. "I said procedures. Respect chain of command, everyone." The irony was not lost on Harold. The procedures that had failed to protect innocent lives for decades were now the same procedures being used to contain the truth he had exposed. But he said nothing. He let them talk, let them flail, let them reveal the fear in their eyes. Later that morning, the backlash escalated beyond whispers. Anonymous calls were made to media outlets, suggesting that Harold had manipulated Marion Peters, coaching her to provide false testimony. Social media accounts sprang up overnight, questioning his motives, painting him as a troublemaker trying to tarnish the precinct's reputation. At home, Harold received threatening messages. Some were direct, some were veiled warnings. "Step back or regret it." Another, scribbled on a post-it, slipped under his door. "You think the public will care? We'll make sure you regret this." Harold folded the notes carefully. He had anticipated this. Fear, threats, attempts to discredit him, these were all tools wielded by the powerful when their secrets were exposed. He had faced decades of systemic indifference. This was just the next stage. The community reaction, however, was different. Neighborhood groups, legal aid organizations, and former victims rallied behind Harold. Calls flooded in from people eager to share stories that had been ignored, forgotten, or dismissed. He was inundated with accounts of misconduct, corroborations of Marion's testimony, and even new leads that might never have surfaced without this renewed scrutiny. Every story strengthened the foundation of truth he had built. But inside the precinct, the tension was suffocating. Officers who once dismissed Harold now avoided him entirely, unsure if they should speak or stay silent. Emails criticizing his credibility arrived in the captain's inbox, anonymous notes appeared under desk drawers, and a few officers even tried subtle intimidation, clearing hallways when he passed, locking office doors, and murmuring threats under their breath. Harold understood the psychology at play. He had seen it during his own life. Fear manifests as aggression. Those who had hidden wrongdoing for decades now sought to transfer their guilt onto him, to portray him as the problem rather than confront their own complicity. The media caught wind of the mounting tension. Reporters camped outside the precinct, capturing images of Harold entering and leaving, speculating on the old man challenging the system. Headlines were both supportive and critical. "Grandfather Sparks' investigation" ran alongside "Is Harold Thompson playing politics?" In households across the city, people debated him, but few could deny that action had been taken. Decades of silence were cracking. Even within Harold's circle of supporters, concern grew. Marion Peters worried for his safety. "Harold, people don't take kindly to being exposed," she warned. "They're powerful. Some of them can make your life difficult." Harold's reply was quiet but firm.
They only have power if I let them. Truth doesn't wait for their comfort. By midweek, the backlash turned more personal. Harold received a visit from 2 uniformed officers under the guise of routine questions. They were polite, but their intent was clear: to intimidate, to remind him that the system could bite back. "Mr. Thompson," one said, tone measured, "we're just checking in. Some questions about your role in the case review. You understand that making false statements can carry consequences, correct?" Harold met their gaze evenly. "I've only shared what I know to be true. If that causes discomfort, that's on those responsible, not me." The officers left, tension lingering in the air like smoke. Across town, City Hall staff began noticing the public pressure mounting. Council members received emails from constituents demanding accountability, demanding updates, demanding justice. Harold's actions had become a lever for change, far larger than any individual grievance. By Friday, the precinct's leadership convened an emergency meeting. Captain Reynolds, visibly stressed, tried to formulate a containment plan, but his options were shrinking. Legal teams demanded transparency, media inquiries intensified, witnesses, emboldened by Harold's courage, prepared to speak openly. The backlash had evolved into a storm, one that threatened the credibility of the entire department if mishandled. In the midst of it all, Harold remained a constant. His demeanor never wavered. His eyes, though tired from decades of fighting alone, held a clarity that cut through the noise. Every whisper, every threat, every attempt to discredit him reinforced one truth: he was no longer ignored. By the weekend, the story had become a citywide discussion. Local news covered it extensively, editorial boards debated the implications, social media algorithms amplified every mention. Harold Thompson, the quiet black grandfather who had been overlooked for decades, had shifted the balance. The backlash had tried to intimidate him into silence, but instead it had illuminated the very injustice he sought to correct. And Harold knew this was only the beginning. The system might push back, the threats might escalate, and the opponents might grow desperate. But the truth, once unearthed, could not be buried again. The backlash was real. It was frightening. It was personal. But Harold Thompson had spent a lifetime preparing for exactly this moment, and he would not step back. Not now. Not ever. The backlash had been loud, personal, and unrelenting, but for Harold Thompson, it had only fueled the fire. He sat at the edge of his worn recliner, the morning sunlight cutting through the blinds and highlighting the fine lines on his face, a lifetime of experience, pain, and observation etched into every crease. The precinct's whispers, the anonymous notes, the social media smear campaigns, they meant nothing if he didn't act. And Harold had never been the type to sit back. The old case files lay spread across his small kitchen table, yellowed and brittle from decades of neglect. Evidence folders, photographs, scribbled witness statements, each piece a fragment of truth that had been buried under bureaucracy and prejudice. Harold had memorized every detail, every name, every date, every hint that someone in the precinct had looked the other way when a child was in danger, when justice was avoided because the victims didn't have a voice. He picked up a photograph of a young boy, hands folded, eyes wary, taken during an investigation 30 years ago. The child had vanished from the public eye, lost in a system that refused to acknowledge mistakes. Harold's fingers trembled slightly as he set the photo down. It wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about being ignored. It was about making sure no one else suffered because people in power had closed their eyes. By mid-morning, Harold made his way to the precinct. The tension was thick in the air as he walked past officers who avoided his gaze, whispering under their breath. The fallout from his actions over the past week had unsettled the station to its core. Captain Reynolds had attempted to maintain authority, but Harold could sense the unease, the vulnerability. Even those who had once scoffed at him now glanced nervously when he passed. He made a beeline for Detective Lewis, who had been his quiet ally in the shadows. "We can't wait for them to move," Harold said firmly. "If we're going to get to the truth, we have to start the hunt ourselves." Lewis nodded slowly, adjusting his tie. "Agreed, But we have to be careful. Every move we make is being watched. The backlash has already begun. People are scared, people who should be helping us." Harold's jaw tightened. "Scared doesn't change the past, and it won't stop me from making them listen." Their first stop was the archives, a dusty room in the back of the precinct, stacked floor to ceiling with decades of files. Lewis unlocked the door with a worn key, the hinges squealing like the ghosts of past injustices. They moved quietly among the shelves, pulling down boxes labeled with case numbers that had long since faded. Each folder was a thread, and Harold knew that if he could follow them carefully, the tapestry of lies and negligence would unravel. As they sifted through evidence, Harold's mind raced. Witness statements that had been ignored, reports that had vanished, photographs that contradicted official narratives, they were all here. Some were faded almost beyond legibility, ink smeared from years of humidity. Others were meticulously preserved, filed with care to appear legitimate, but Harold could see the patterns, the cases that were conveniently closed, the victims who were dismissed, the officers whose reports contained just enough ambiguity to avoid scrutiny. Hours passed. Each piece of evidence they uncovered added weight to the story Harold was building, and the more they found, the clearer it became that someone in the precinct had been systematically covering up serious misconduct. The files weren't just historical records, they were proof of a culture that had allowed abuse and injustice to flourish, shielded by silence and fear. By afternoon, Harold and Lewis had compiled a short list of officers whose actions, or inaction, had played critical roles in the cover-ups. They cross-referenced reports, memos, and witness statements, highlighting contradictions and timelines that didn't add up. Every discrepancy was a nail in the coffin of the false narrative that had been carefully constructed over decades. But the hunt wasn't without danger. Word of their investigation began to leak, despite their precautions. Emails were intercepted, and subtle threats started to arrive, both in the precinct and via Harold's home phone. "Stop digging, old man. Some truths are better left buried." Harold held the note briefly, then folded it neatly. He wasn't afraid. He had faced indifference and hostility his entire life, and nothing would stop him now. As evening approached, Harold and Lewis decided to visit Marion Peters again. She had been a key witness, her testimony pivotal in reigniting the investigation, but she had faced pressure too, harassment, whispers of lies, and fear that coming forward would ruin her life. Harold wanted to ensure she felt safe and supported. Marion opened the door cautiously, her eyes lighting up when she saw Harold. "I was worried. I didn't know if I should speak again." "You did the right thing," Harold said firmly. "Truth needs witnesses like you. Without it, nothing changes." They spent hours reviewing the timeline, cross-checking her statements against the evidence they had compiled. Marion's courage bolstered Harold's resolve, and together they filled in gaps, corrected inconsistencies, and strengthened the narrative that would expose the cover-ups once and for all. Meanwhile, tensions at the precinct continued to rise. Officers who had previously ignored Harold's presence now whispered about the old man and his crusade, debating whether to confront him or stay silent. Emails circulated, some attempting to undermine his credibility, others questioning Lewis's involvement. The atmosphere was electric with unease. Every desk, every hallway conversation now carried the weight of scrutiny. By nightfall, Harold left Marion's apartment, his mind still racing. The city outside was quiet, the streets glistening from a recent rain. He walked slowly, cane tapping against the pavement, each sound a reminder of the relentless passage of time. But Harold knew that his hunt had only just begun. He had exposed the first cracks in the wall of lies, but the foundation was still strong, still defended by those with power and influence. To break it completely, Harold would need allies, strategy, and unyielding determination, and he had all three. Back at his small apartment, Harold spread the files across his kitchen table, now littered with pens, sticky notes, and photographs, maps of precinct floors, charts of officer activity, and highlighted witness statements transformed the table into a war room. Every detail mattered. Every discrepancy could be leveraged. The hunt was no longer theoretical. It was active, deliberate, and relentless. Outside, the city slept, unaware that a quiet black grandfather was orchestrating a pursuit that would shake the foundations of the precinct. Harold's reputation had been dismissed for decades, but that would change. By the time his investigation concluded, no one would ignore him again. The hunt had begun, and there would be no turning back. By midnight, Harold sat back in his chair, exhausted but determined. The files lay before him like a battlefield map. Every thread, every witness, every forgotten detail had been gathered. The backlash might be brutal, the threats persistent, but the truth had a new guardian, and Harold Thompson was ready to lead the charge. Tomorrow, the hunt would intensify. Officers who thought they were untouchable would face scrutiny, witnesses would speak, evidence would surface, and the quiet grandfather, once ignored and belittled, would force a reckoning that no one could escape. The hunt had begun, and this time the system would be forced to listen.
The morning sun cut through the blinds of Harold Thompson's small apartment, slanting across the files that had consumed his nights for weeks. Each folder, each photograph, each faded report seemed to vibrate with urgency. Today wasn't about planning. Today was about action. Every person who had ignored him, every officer who had dismissed his quiet presence, every bureaucrat who buried the truth behind signatures and stamps, today they would have to listen. Harold moved slowly, but with deliberate purpose, cane tapping softly against the floor. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind for weeks. Every word he would speak, every piece of evidence he would present, every confrontation he anticipated, he had considered it all. Yet even now he felt the weight of decades pressing against his shoulders. Not of guilt, not of fear, but of responsibility. The truth had waited long enough. By mid-morning, the precinct was buzzing with unusual activity. Rumors of Harold's impending action had spread quickly. Officers whispered behind closed doors, supervisors exchanged cautious glances, and Captain Reynolds paced with furrowed brows. No one had anticipated that a man who had been quietly ignored for decades would amass such a formidable arsenal of evidence. Harold entered the station with Marion Peters and Detective Lewis flanking him. The trio carried folders, photographs, and audio recordings, each meticulously labeled, each a piece of a puzzle that had been ignored for far too long. The silence that fell over the main office was palpable. Officers who had spent their careers belittling Harold and dismissing complaints now looked up in surprise, uncertainty etched across their faces. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat, trying to assert control, but his voice faltered under the weight of the tension in the room. "Harold, what is this about?" Harold's eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned the room. "This," he said, placing a thick folder on the center table, "is about decades of negligence, cover-ups, ignored victims, and officers who thought they could silence the truth because it was inconvenient." Murmurs rippled across the room. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others exchanged worried glances. Harold ignored the whispers. He had learned long ago that the judgment of those too comfortable in their positions was irrelevant. The truth didn't care about comfort. It demanded acknowledgement. He opened the folder and began methodically presenting the evidence. Photographs of neglected crime scenes, reports that contradicted eyewitness accounts, memos that had been altered to protect officers. Each page elicited reactions ranging from shock to outright disbelief. Marion's testimony was presented with precision, corroborated by Detective Lewis's notes and cross-referenced timelines. The inconsistencies were undeniable, the cover-ups deliberate. "Detective Johnson," Harold said, addressing one of the senior officers who had long dismissed his concerns, "explain why these reports were altered, why witnesses were ignored, why crimes were left unresolved." Johnson shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. I don't know what you mean. Procedures were followed." "Procedures," Harold rose, calm but thunderous. "Procedures allowed abuse to continue unchecked. Procedures protected those who should have been held accountable. You call that justice?" A hush fell over the room. Even Captain Reynolds, who had tried to maintain authority, seemed momentarily paralyzed. The weight of Harold's words pressed against the walls of the precinct, leaving no room for denial. Harold continued, revealing audio recordings and internal communications that had been hidden, intentionally misfiled or dismissed. Officers who once laughed at his quiet presence now shifted in their chairs, sweat forming on brows, hands clutching clipboards for comfort. Evidence of deliberate obstruction, intimidation of witnesses, and falsified reports painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Then came the final blow, a list of victims who had been dismissed or forgotten, along with statements detailing the long-term consequences of the precinct's inaction. Harold's voice softened as he read their words aloud, each sentence a reminder that behind every file was a life affected, a voice silenced, a trust betrayed. "You ignored them," Harold said, his eyes meeting those of every officer in the room. "You dismissed their pain. You told yourselves it wasn't your problem because they weren't part of your world. But now the world is listening, and you will answer." Captain Reynolds finally spoke, voice tight. "Harold, this is serious. Some of these cases go back decades. Investigations were closed. We can't reopen everything." "You can," Harold interrupted, voice firm. "You will, or you will answer for every person whose life you've diminished. The statute of limitations does not erase moral responsibility. It does not erase the consequences of silence." Officers shifted nervously. Whispers turned to murmurs. Some pleaded silently with each other to stay calm, while others avoided Harold's gaze entirely. The room that had once dismissed him as just the quiet old man now hung on every word. His presence, once invisible, was now undeniable. Detective Lewis stepped forward, adding corroborating details. "We've cross-referenced every file. Every witness we spoke to has confirmed the discrepancies. The patterns are consistent. This is systemic, and it needs to be addressed immediately." Marion Peters, trembling but resolute, added her voice. "I've told my story. I've named names, and I'm not the only one. There are others who've been too afraid to speak, but today we speak." The combined weight of their presentation left the room in stunned silence. Officers who had spent decades believing themselves untouchable were now faced with irrefutable evidence. The hierarchy they had relied on was crumbling. The culture of silence was breaking. Captain Reynolds finally sat, rubbing his temples. "We need to follow procedure. We'll need internal affairs, outside legal counsel, and a review board. This is significant." Harold nodded. "Yes, and it needs to be transparent. No more hiding, no more excuses. We owe it to the victims, to the community, and to ourselves if we want to call ourselves law enforcement." The remainder of the day was a whirlwind. Internal affairs were notified, outside legal counsel was consulted, and a press briefing was prepared. By evening, the news had spread. Social media lit up with headlines, "Decades of neglect exposed at local precinct," and "Quiet grandfather forces reckoning in the police department." Public interest surged as the story unfolded, citizens demanding accountability, respect, and transparency. Through it all, Harold remained calm. He knew that the journey wasn't over. There would be resistance, denials, and attempts to minimize the fallout. But for the first time in decades, the precinct and the city had no choice but to listen. The voices that had been silenced were finally being heard. That night, Harold returned to his apartment, exhausted but resolute. The city outside hummed with a renewed awareness of justice, accountability, and the power of one determined individual. He sat at his kitchen table, reviewing the evidence one last time. Every folder, every photograph, every note was a testament to persistence, courage, and the refusal to accept injustice. And for the first time in decades, Harold allowed himself a small, quiet smile. He had been ignored, dismissed, and belittled for too long, but now he had forced a reckoning. A truth had been spoken, a system challenged, and a message sent. No voice is too quiet to be heard, no witness too old or tired to make a difference, and no injustice too deeply buried to remain hidden. As the city slept, the precinct remained in turmoil. Investigations were reopened,
Officers were questioned, witnesses were called forward, and Harold Thompson, once a silent observer of injustice, had become the catalyst for a transformation that would ripple through the department for years to come. The final reckoning wasn't just about accountability, it was about restoring faith, faith in the system, faith in the community, and faith in the idea that one determined voice, no matter how quiet, could force the world to listen. And Harold, a quiet black grandfather who had once been ignored, knew that this was only the beginning, because now the world would finally pay attention.